And as they moved away from shearing into grinding, that meant that they needed to add enamel to make the teeth tougher for this new type of diet. So, why did these changes start to occur? So these first two things, bipedalism and then a change of diet. Well, once again, let's think about this from a scientific perspective, and let's have a hypothesis. Well, if the earliest evidence, and we'll see this in a little bit here for the fossil record of that bipedalism is the first thing to occur, the first thing that we see, so that's the earliest change. Why did that take place? Well, Charles Darwin had a hypothesis that he called the hunting hypothesis. And he thought that, well, okay, if we evolved all of these features, bipedalism, non-honing canines, tool use, speech, language, cooperative hunting, and domestication. These are if you think of all of these things, Charles Darwin, back in the 19th century, didn't have any fossil evidence. He didn't know the order in which these would take place. So he said it was for hunting, that our ancestors in the past started to transform their behavior. And meat is a very good source of food. And if you can get it, then you might be more successful than if you were just strictly a vegetarian. So he saw all of this package of things that humans had, and he hypothesized. Now remember, a hypothesis is not evidence or proof. He had an idea that needed to be tested, and he didn't have the evidence to be able to test it. We now have the ability to test his hunting hypothesis. And for it to be a valid hypothesis, it has to be if-then. So he said, if hunting was the thing that started to transform humans, then you would see this evolution take place. He hypothesized that in Africa, you would see eventually fossils that had tool use first, because we don't have the capability to chase down a deer on our own feet. So we need some way to wound the animal and run after them. And so he thought that tool use would be first. And that tool use would then prompt us to have a larger brain, because that would then allow us to get better tools. So rewarded by tool use, we could then feed a very expensive, very hard to maintain brain, but that would actually work better. So tools and the brain started to interact. And after that change in diet of primarily going towards meat, then our canines would reduce. All of this is being done when we're knuckle walkers or quadrupeds. But because tools became so important to our survival, then we would stand up and start walking on 2 feet that would free up our hands for bipedalism. The problem with this, the evidence is completely the opposite. So Charles Darwin, I'm sure, would be very happy today to hear that his hypothesis has been completely disproven. It has been completely falsified. He is totally, totally wrong. Because, as I said, you would expect to see tools first, then the brain expand, then the canines reduce, and then you would see bipedalism in that order. And we actually have it the exact opposite way around. The first thing to happen is bipedalism, and then canines start to reduce, and then we get tool use. So, and meat eating after that. So his hypothesis is completely wrong, and we have to come up with some new hypotheses based on the evidence. That's just the way science works. So where are we now? Well, because we know that bipedalism is the first thing, Peter Rodman and Henry McHenry came up with what's called the patchy forest hypothesis. And they suggested that due to climate change, perhaps the shrinking of forests created these little patchwork areas of forests where our ancestors were required to move from across some savanna territory, some grasslands, to get from one area to the other, and bipedalism was rewarded in that way. It's a fine idea. The problem is that first of all, it seems as though bipedalism first emerged in forests. We have very strong evidence that the earliest human ancestors that became bipedal were doing so in a forest. So that is not very strong support of a patchy forest hypothesis, although there may have been some advantage to being able to access resources out on the open plains. Also, they hypothesized that bipedalism could have been more energy efficient for moving around in between the forests, but this has actually come up into a little bit of dispute scientifically, and we're not quite sure whether this is of a great benefit to bipedal creatures. So we're sort of on the fence about the patchy forest hypothesis. Another one that seems a little bit off the wall, but actually, if you think about it, has a little bit of weight to it. It's hard to prove, though. It's a hypothesis called the provisioning hypothesis. And essentially, this is that it's taking some of these changes as a group, rather than just people started standing up and then said, oh, hey, let's start doing things as bipedal creatures now. That actually the evolution was interrelated to behavior and diet and all these sorts of things. That upright walking, small non-honing canines as they started to be emerging, and pair bonding was an interrelated package. And because humans have a rather short interbirth period of only 2 to 3 years, that means that females have a lot of pressure to feed their young. And so they benefit from having some support from male partners especially, but also other relatives. We talked previously about the grandmother hypothesis. And so if a male partner wants to reproduce with the female, she might only reproduce with the male partner who has taken care of her in the year that year leading up to their mating season. So maybe provisioning is part of this, that only creatures who are given the opportunity to reproduce are those that are taking care of one another. And so bipedalism started to emerge as a way for males to actually bring and provision items for a female partner. This also emerged with the loss of the canines, the change of the diet, so new types of foods, but also the increase in pair bonding. And so this was a reinforcing feature that it wasn't that you had less male-male aggression, more pair bonding, and more provisioning, which you could do better if you were bipedal by being able to literally pick stuff up and bring it to your partner. So it's difficult to pinpoint one cause of this, but this would also make sense in a forested environment as well. So although this is certainly not proof by any means, the provisioning hypothesis is something that has been proposed, and I think actually has probably a little bit of legitimacy to it. So where are these first hominins found? Well, Africa is where we find the earliest evidence for the creatures that are on our branch and not on the line that would become chimpanzees, bonobos. So the last common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees and bonobos, the genetic clock, as it's called, meaning that how long does it take for the 3% of mutations that make us different from chimpanzees and bonobos today? How long does that 3% mutation need time to be able to form? Well, the estimate is about 10 million to 8 million years ago. And so that if you're looking for fossils that are on our line, the first of the human line of the hominin lines, you would expect to look at about 8 million, 7 million years ago. And as if on cue, there are some early examples. Now, the first two that we're going to look at, the earliest is called Sahelanthropus chadensis, and it is not in one of these hotspots that I've been talking about. It's not from the Great Rift Valley. It's not from Olduvai Gorge. It's from Chad, the country of Chad, as the name Chadensis suggests. And some intrepid paleontologists went to their country of Chad and found some very early fossils. And we think that it was bipedal because we've found part of the foramen magnum that shows that it actually, the spine would have connected to the cranium in a perpendicular manner. And so that's a very strong suggestion that it was a bipedal ape. We'll come to them in a second. The next is Aurorantugenesis, which is from the Great Rift Valley. And then we have Ardipithecus, and two species of Ardipithecus, Cadaba and Ramidus. The earliest, we have a pretty well-preserved skull with a fairly small brain. It's a very large brow ridge, about that of found on a male gorilla. This Sahelanthropus chadensis from the country of Chad is from about 6 to 7 million years ago, and it was found, would have been near a forest lake. There's very strong evidence that this would have been a forested area, and it would have been a nice little lake zone. It has a small brain, about 350 cubic centimeters. By contrast, we have about 1450 cubic centimeters. This is 350 cubic centimeters, cc's, as I'll call them from now on. 350 cc's is about the same size as a chimpanzee's brain. And so we can assume that Sahelanthropus chadensis was about as clever as a chimpanzee. But it had smallish canines, and they didn't hone. And so they were losing their diastema. But they had, so their diet may be changing. They may have been bipedal, but apart from that, they're very much like that, probably not too far off of a common ancestor with a chimpanzee or a bonobo. It's even possible that this is pre-split between chimpanzees and humans. It could even be ancestor to both. We don't really know. It seems likely because it's most likely a bipedal creature, that it's on our line, that it's a hominin, but it could very early be a very early evidence of our line. But is it directly related to us? We don't exactly know. There's really only one species from this time period, so we don't have much of a context to fit it into. But it is exactly when you would expect, based on genetics, when you would expect to see the first of the hominin lines start to form. Next, from about 6 million years ago, also in a forested area, is Aurorantugenesis. This is in the Tugen Hills in Kenya, found there, and based largely on a femur, but they're the neck of the femur bone, which has been found, is elongated, which is functionally related to bipedalism. And so once again, you don't necessarily have to have that foramen magnum to indicate that you're likely dealing with a bipedal creature. We have an elongated neck to our femur, and so does Aurorantugenesis, whereas a chimpanzee has a much more compacted, shorter neck to their femur. So it seems likely that based on this obturator externus groove, which is that extended neck, that they were upright walkers, but at the same time, it seems like They've got long hand bones and long curved fingers. That they probably also climbed trees regularly. And so this was found in what would have been a forested area. And so when they were on the ground, it seems like they were walking upright, but they spent a lot of time in trees as well. And so maybe you can think that Ororantugenesis went to sleep in trees to get away from predators or things, but actually foraged and moved around on the forest floor during the daytime. Also, they exhibit some honing to their canines, but it's what we call peri-honing complex. So they're starting to lose that honing capability, which means that their diet is perhaps changing. Are they on our line? Once again, like Sahelanthropus, we're not sure if Auroran is on our line or some competitors, but they do seem to indicate a type of hominin, one that is bipedal, losing a honing canine, but whether it's directly related to us or not is uncertain. The next one, however, of the pre-Australopithecines is what's called Ardipithecus. And this is found first, there's two species of Ardipithecus. The earlier is called Kadaba, and that dates from about 5.8 million years ago to about 5.2 million years ago. And then a more recent species called Ardipithecus ramidus from about 4.4 million years ago. Ardipithecus Kadaba, also found in what would have been a forested area, was bipedal based on what we know about their toe bones. Their toes would have had a development of a foot that was more adapted to upright walking, but they also had a peri-honing complex. So their teeth are similar to a chimpanzee, but they had a weakly developed honing complex. And so they were losing this ability to hone the teeth, even though their canines were actually quite large. About a million years later, about 4.4 million years ago, also in a forested area in a similar part of the Middle Awash Valley in Ethiopia, comes Ardipithecus ramidus, and a really, really well-preserved skeleton was discovered, which gives us a really clear idea of what this creature was like. And it's almost entirely certain that this is the precursor to a whole genus that we'll see for the next couple million years, the Australopithecines that I mentioned at the start of this talk. The brain is small, really no bigger than a female chimpanzee in Ardipithecus ramidus. Long fingers, so they could climb trees, also could grasp with their feet, so they had long grasping toes as well as long grasping hands. But no evidence that they would have walked on their knuckles. And so there's several different aspects of the foot, pelvis, femur, that all indicate that this would have been a bipedal creature. And so Ardipithecus ramidus was pretty clearly a bipedal creature, and also had non-honing canines at this point. And it seems pretty clear that this has anatomical features that are the precursors to what we're going to see next in line, which is the Australopithecines. So Ardipithecus ramidus seems to be the ancestor to all Australopithecines. So I think I'll end it there for the moment, and we'll pick back up, because Australopithecus is a big topic. A lot of different species of Australopithecus that I think we need to deal with on a certain level. So we're going to pick back up with chapter 10 in the second half. We've done the pre-Australopithecines, and now next we're going to look at, in part 2, the Australopithecines themselves and how those developed into Homo, our genus.